Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I'm going to do a soft-spoken reading. I haven't done any soft-spoken readings or videos for a while, and I know that people like the soft-spoken as well as whispered. I'm also having a cup of cappuccino today instead of a latte. And my machine doesn't actually make a very big coffee, so this cup is probably a bit too big for the amount of coffee that you actually get in it, about 3/4 full. So let's try it. It's quite nice. The reading today, we're going to go a little bit highbrow, and this is either going to bore some of you to sleep, which maybe is the idea, or it will interest some of you, or some of you will be not that interested. Now, it's a Dorling Kindersley book. It is called The Philosophy Book, and it contains a simplified version of philosophies of famous philosophers, I think. I have to say, this is my own book. Big ideas, simply explained. The kind of thing that I need, simply explained. And I've had a quick flick through, and it does look quite interesting. So I'm going to probably randomly choose some of the philosophers and different chapters to read. So we have in the contents the ancient world, 700 BCE to 250 CE, and these are the different chapters. So we have Pythagoras and Epicurus, Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, Confucius. And then we have the medieval world, 250 to 1500. We have Saint Augustine of Hippo, Avicenna, Saint Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, and then we have the Renaissance and the Age of Reason, 1500 to 1750. And we have here Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, René Descartes, George Berkeley, depending on how you want to say that. And then we have a chapter on the Age of Revolution, 1750 to 1900. And here we have Adam Smith, Voltaire, Edmund Burke, Immanuel Kant, Mary Wollstonecraft, Frankenstein, Friedrich Schlegel, George Hegel, Karl Marx, various others. And then it takes us to the modern world, 1900 to 1950. We have Nietzsche, and we have Henri Bergson, John Dewey, Bertrand Russell, Max Scheler, Hannah Arendt, Jean-Paul Sartre. And then we have contemporary philosophy, 1950 to the present. John Rawls, Mary Midgley, Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Frantz Fanon, Jacques Derrida, Edward Said. And then there is also a directory, glossary, index, and acknowledgements at the back. So, why don't we have a look at the introduction? First of all, So, philosophy is not just the preserve of brilliant but eccentric thinkers that it is popularly supposed to be. It is what everyone does when they're not busy dealing with their everyday business and get a chance simply to wonder what life and the universe are all about. We human beings are naturally inquisitive creatures and can't help wondering about the world around us and our place in it. We're also equipped with a powerful intellectual capacity which allows us to reason as well as just wonder. Although we may not realise it, whenever we reason, we're thinking philosophically. Philosophy is not so much about coming up with the answers to fundamental questions as it is about the process of trying to find these answers, using reasoning rather than accepting without question conventional views or traditional authority. I'm sorry about the dog barking in the background. The very first philosophers in ancient Greece and China were thinkers who were not satisfied with the established explanations provided by religion and custom, and sought answers which had rational justifications. And just as we might share our views with friends and colleagues, they discussed their ideas with one another, and even set up schools to teach not just the conclusions they had come to, but the way they had come to them. They encouraged their students to disagree and criticise ideas as a means of refining them and coming up with new and different ones. A popular misconception is that of the solitary philosopher arriving at his conclusions in isolation, but this is actually seldom the case. New ideas emerge through discussion and the examination, analysis and criticism of other people's ideas. Debate and dialogue. The archetypical philosopher in this respect was Socrates. He didn't leave any writings or even any big ideas as the conclusions of his thinking. Indeed, he prided himself on being the wisest of men because he knew he didn't know anything. His legacy lay in the tradition he established of debate and discussion, of questioning the assumptions of other people to gain deeper understanding and elicit fundamental truths. The writings of Socrates' pupil Plato are almost invariably in the form of dialogues with Socrates as a major character. Many later philosophers also adopted the device of dialogues to present their ideas, giving arguments and counter-arguments rather than a simple statement of their reasoning and conclusions. The philosopher who presents his ideas to the world is liable to be met with comments beginning "yes, but," or "what if," rather than wholehearted acceptance. In fact, philosophers have fiercely disagreed with one another about almost every aspect of philosophy. Plato and his pupil Aristotle, for example, held diametrically opposed views on fundamental philosophical questions, and their different approaches have divided opinions among philosophers ever since. This has, in turn, provoked more discussion and prompted yet more fresh ideas. But how can it be that these philosophical questions are still being discussed and debated? Why haven't thinkers come up with definitive answers? What are these fundamental questions that philosophers through the ages have wrestled with? Now, let me have some coffee first before we continue. Existence and knowledge. When the first true philosophers appeared in ancient Greece some 2,500 years ago, it was the world around them that inspired their sense of wonder. They saw the earth and all the different forms of life inhabiting it, the sun, moon, planets, and stars, and natural phenomena such as the weather, earthquakes and eclipses. They sought explanations for all these things, not the traditional myths and legends about the gods, but something that would satisfy their curiosity and their intellect. The first question that occupied these early philosophers was, what is the universe made of? Which was soon expanded to become the wider question of, what is the nature of whatever it is that exists? This is the branch of philosophy we now call metaphysics. Although much of the original question has since been explained by modern science, related questions of metaphysics, such as, why is there something rather than nothing, are not so simply answered, because we too exist as a part of the universe. Metaphysics also considers the nature of human existence and what it means to be a conscious being. How do we perceive the world around us, and do things exist independently of our perception? What is the relationship between our mind and body, and is there such a thing as an immortal soul? The area of metaphysics concerned with questions of existence, ontology, is a huge one and forms the basis for much of Western philosophy. Once philosophers had started to put received wisdom to the test of rational examination, another fundamental question became obvious. How can we know? The study of the nature and limits of knowledge forms a second main branch of philosophy, epistemology. At its heart is the question of how we acquire knowledge. How we come to know what we know. Is some, or even all, knowledge innate? Or do we learn everything from experience? Can we know something from reasoning alone? These questions are vital to philosophical thinking, as we need to be able to rely on our knowledge. In order to reason correctly, we also need to determine the scope and limits of our knowledge. Otherwise, we cannot be sure that we actually do know what we think we know, and haven't somehow been tricked into believing it by our senses. More coffee. Logic and language. Reasoning relies on establishing the truth of statements, which can then be used to build up a train of thought leading to a conclusion. This might seem obvious to us now, but the idea of constructing a rational argument distinguished philosophy from the superstitious and religious explanations that had existed before the first philosophers. These thinkers had to devise a way of ensuring their ideas had validity. What emerged from their thinking was logic, a technique of reasoning that was gradually refined over time. At first, simply a useful tool for analysing whether an argument held water, logic developed rules and conventions and soon became a field of study in its own right, another branch of the expanding subject of philosophy. Like so much of philosophy, logic has intimate connections with science and mathematics in particular. The basic structure of a logical argument, starting from a premise and working through a series of steps to a conclusion, is the same as that of a mathematical proof. It's not surprising, then, that philosophers have often turned to mathematics for example of self-evident, incontrovertible truths. Not that many of the greatest thinkers, from Pythagoras to René Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz, were also accomplished mathematicians. Although logic might seem to be the most exact and scientific branch of philosophy, a field where things are either right or wrong, a closer look at the subject shows that it is not so simple. Advances in mathematics in the 19th century called into question the rules of logic that had been laid down by Aristotle, but even in ancient times. Zeno of Elea's famous paradoxes reached absurd conclusions from apparently faultless arguments. A large part of the problem is that philosophical logic, unlike mathematics, is expressed in words rather than numbers or symbols, and is subject to all the ambiguities and subtleties inherent in language. Constructing a reasoned argument involves using language carefully and accurately, examining our statements and arguments to make sure they mean what we think they mean. And when we study other people's arguments, we have to analyse not only the logical steps they take, but also the language they use to see if their conclusions hold water. Out of this process came yet another field of philosophy that flourished in the 20th century, the philosophy of language, which examined terms and their meanings. Okay, so I think we'll leave the introduction there. That's quite a long one, but I think we've got the basic idea. And let's step into the ancient world. 700 BCE, that's before the Common Era, to 250 CE, the Common Era. And I shall have a bit of coffee. Again. And this is a timeline here. Birth of Pythagoras, 569 BCE, and various things. Aristotle, Plato's student, opens his own school in Athens, the Lyceum, 335 BCE. So let's see. Now this is everything is made of water. Let's try. That's Chinese philosophy. Should we have a look at Pythagoras? Let's have a look at Pythagoras. Okay. Number is the ruler of forms and ideas. Pythagoras, circa 570 to 495 BCE. So the context is the branch is Metaphysics. The approach is Pythagoreanism. Before that, 6th century BCE, I don't know whether that's Thales or Tales. Somebody will tell me how to pronounce that. Proposes a non-religious explanation of the cosmos, and he was back there. And then after this we have Heraclitus dismisses Pythagoreanism and says that the cosmos is governed by change. And they're the other things that come after as well. So let's read a bit about the man. Little is known about Pythagoras' life. He left no writings himself, and unfortunately, as the Greek philosopher Porphyry noted in his Vita Pythagorae, no one knows for certain what Pythagoras told his associates, since they observed an unusual silence. However, modern scholars believe that Pythagoras was probably born on the island of Samos off the coast of modern-day Turkey. As a young man, he travelled widely, perhaps studying at the Melesian school, and probably visiting Egypt, which was a centre of learning. At the age of about 40, he set up a community of around 300 people in Croton, southern Italy. Its members studied a mixture of mystical and academic studies, and despite its collective nature, Pythagoras was clearly the community's leader. At the age of 60, he is said to have married a young girl, Theno of Crotona. Growing hostility towards the Pythagorean cult eventually forced him to leave Croton, and he fled to Metapontum, also in southern Italy, where he died soon after. His community had virtually disappeared by the end of the 4th century BCE. So, let's see what we have over here. Okay. Okay, so I think the best thing to do is actually just to start from here. Western philosophy was in its infancy when Pythagoras was born. In Miletus, Greece, a group of philosophers known collectively as the Milesian School had started to seek rational explanations for natural phenomena only a generation or so earlier, marking the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. Pythagoras spent his childhood not far from Miletus, so it is very likely that he knew of them, and may even have studied in their academy. Like Thales or Thales, maybe, the founder of the Milesian school, Pythagoras is said to have learned the rudiments of geometry during a trip to Egypt. With this background, it is not surprising that he should approach philosophical thinking in a scientific and mathematical way. The Pythagorean Academy. Pythagoras was also, however, a deeply religious and superstitious man. He believed in reincarnation and the transmigration of souls, and he established a religious cult, with himself cast as a virtual messiah, in Croton, southern Italy. His disciples lived in a collective commune, following strict behavioural and dietary rules while studying his religious and philosophical theories. The Pythagoreans, as his disciples were known, saw his ideas as mystical revelations, to the extent that some of the discoveries attributed to him as revelations may in fact have come from others in the community. His ideas were recorded by his students, who included his wife, Theno of Crotona, and daughters. The two sides of Pythagoras' beliefs, the mystical and the scientific, seem to be irreconcilable, but Pythagoras himself does not see them as contradictory. For him, the goal of life is freedom from the cycle of reincarnation, which can be gained by adhering to a strict set of behavioural rules and by contemplation, or what we would call objective scientific thinking. In geometry and mathematics, he found truths that he regarded as self-evident, as if God-given, and worked out mathematical proofs that had the impact of divine revelation. Because these mathematical discoveries were a product of pure reasoning, Pythagoras believes they are more valuable than mere observations. For example, the Egyptians had discovered that a triangle whose sides have ratios of 3, 4, 5 always has a right angle, and this was useful in practice, such as in architecture. But Pythagoras uncovered the underlying principle behind all right-angled triangles, that the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, and found it to be universally true. This discovery was so extraordinary and held such potential that the Pythagoreans took it to be divine revelation. Pythagoras concludes that the whole cosmos must be governed by mathematical rules. He says that numbers, numerical ratios, and mathematical axioms can be used to explain the very structure of the cosmos. He does not totally dismiss the Milesian idea that the universe is made up of one fundamental substance, but he shifts the inquiry from substance to form. This was such a profound change in the way of looking at the world that we should probably forgive Pythagoras and his disciples for getting somewhat carried away and giving numbers a mystical significance. Through exploring the relationship between numbers and geometry, they discovered the square numbers and cube numbers that we speak of today, but they also attributed characteristics to them, such as good to the even numbers and evil to the odd ones, and even specifics such as justice to the number 4 and so on. The number 10 in the form of the tetractys, a triangular shape made up of rows of dots, had a particular significance in Pythagorean ritual. Less contentiously, they saw the number 1 as a single point, a unity from which other things could be derived. The number 2, in this way of thinking, was a line, number 3 a surface or plane, and 4 a solid. The correspondence with our modern concept of dimensions is obvious. The Pythagorean explanation of the creation of the universe followed a mathematical pattern on the unlimited, the infinite that existed before the universe. God imposed a limit so that all that exists came to have an actual size. In this way, God created a measurable unity from which everything else was formed. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. Hope you enjoyed that little dip into philosophy, and please tell me if you enjoyed having a look through these, and maybe we can do it again sometime. There's certainly plenty to read. So, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kate at the Library of Whispers saying bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.